let's go ahead and introduce our guest for today. Very excited to have her on. Last time we tried to do it, I was like literally green from being ill. So I'm really glad that we're able to rearrange it. Welcome to the Contraband Wagon, Melanie. How we doing? Oh, you're still on mute. You're still on mute.
Thank you. I think I would be new to Zoom. I said it's good to see you and healthy as well.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thanks for making it work. Melanie, why don't you tell a little bit for our audience to get an idea of what is it that you do? What kind of work do you do? And how did you kind of run into me and end up on the contraband wagon?
Oh, okay. So if I go too long, just cut me off. Feel free. So my background is actually I'm a biologist. I studied an undergrad biology and chemistry, and then ecology as a master's degree. And then my husband got a job. We were in Omaha, and he got a job in Boston. So we moved across the country, and I started teaching. And I was teaching biology for non-majors. So most people who don't want to be scientists when they grow up take like intro bio for their undergrad. And I was teaching that course, and I love biology and I love teaching, and I was loving doing what I'm doing, but I'm thinking this is not the best use of students' time, right? The reason that we teach these courses is science literacy. And I was teaching them all the amazing things that we've learned in biology, but not necessarily how we learn those things. And so I convinced the college to actually take the course off the books, and I created something in its place that I call Science for Life. And I teach skills, not facts. So it's critical thinking, information literacy, and science literacy. And along the way, I started writing for my students, and I started a website, Thinking is Power, where I have like mini courses on there for those same skills. And I discuss like related events. Like, so for example, homeopathy or ghosts or that sort of thing. And so I was on, my husband is a choral director. And actually, we met in choir in college a million years ago, and was asked to be on Chris Munz's podcast. And I believe that's how you found me. I was talking about my skills, not facts approach on that podcast.
That's exactly right. Yeah. Another recent guest on the show. You can check that out, guys, if you're a patron, back in one of our previous updates.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of DEI programs, DEI programs are well-meaning. I really get where they're coming from. The evidence to support them is not good. At best, they don't do anything, and at worst, they're actually counterproductive. They can,
So why do you
if they're,
say why do you say that? What makes you come to that conclusion?
um, well, I mean, the studies that support them, especially the ones that are um, involved with like implicit biases and implicit association tests. I mean, they're not reliable measures. Not only they're not repeatable, but they're not very predictive of how people behave.
Yeah.
And so
So
there's a
so hang on. Let's parse it,
yeah.
right? So we have the implicit bias test studies, right? So I would definitely agree with you that implicit bias tests are not reliable for anything. Um, but that's like a separate question, right?
Well, kind of.
Okay.
So a lot of these programs tend to use those kinds of that part of, I would say, science. So here's the thing. When I say they're counterproductive, often what happens is if they're voluntary, then the people who are into those programs are self-selecting. These are people who are really well-meaning and that realize that they have something to improve upon and tend to be active in those areas and open to the training. There's the other side, and often a huge swath in the middle that don't tend to opt into those programs. And if they're not mandatory, if they're mandatory, so not voluntary, they can be counterproductive, and that people feel blamed, they feel shamed, rightly or wrongly. It still, though, doesn't change their thinking. So we tend to focus on cognitive biases as opposed to implicit biases. So implicit biases are real, but they're learned, right? And so um, cognitive biases are part of the wiring. Like as human beings, we all share the same tendencies towards the same biases and same irrational thinking. And our thinking was that if we could teach people how to think better and teach people the skills of having good conversations, that we could address many social issues, not just racism. We could address sexism and homophobia and whatever pops up tomorrow that we may not even be aware of.
You said when you went to college, I believe, is what you said, is when you really started understanding the diversity of the country. So I want to kind of narrow you down a little bit more. Let's not just stick to diversity of the country, but specifically racial hierarchy. When did you know, like, when did you have a conscious understanding that white people were placed at the top of a racial hierarchy and that you were racialized as white and that other people were not?
Mm.
Even if you
Man,
don't
that is,
know when, even if you don't know like when you became aware that such a thing existed, even if you could think about moments where you saw that differentiation happen. Now, you mentioned your husband, obviously, but it definitely happened before that, right? I'm sure.
yeah, it did. Actually, so again, I come from small town Iowa where everybody was white. And when I went to college, my very first semester in college, my roommate was a Black Muslim. And at the time, she told me that she explicitly that she didn't want to be friends with me. She didn't want to talk to me. She literally put a line of tape down the middle of our dorm room and said, "This is your side and my side." And it was really confusing for me. And honestly, it's taken me a long time to process. And you ask really good questions because it's been a long time since I thought about that. Um, the other thing that adds to this is um, I have um, when I actually learned there was a hierarchy, um, that was probably the Rodney King. Are you old? You probably aren't old enough to
I
remember
am
that.
old enough. Yeah, yeah. I'm old enough.
Right. So the race riots and the Rodney King beating, and the
Did you see the
protests.
video of the beating?
Yeah, yeah. Because at the time they played it on the news. Um, and this was pre-YouTube. They just played it, right? Um, and I remember just like that was shocking. That was really shocking. Um, and there was a lot going on socially at the time. There was a lot going on socially at the time, not just the Rodney King beating, but yeah, it started to open my eyes to like not everybody experiencing life the same way. There's an added thing to this too, though. So like, I grew up really poor and white, and when I say really poor, my mom didn't have running water and electricity growing up. And I was very fortunate in even my small town where there were a lot of students who, looking back, I had no idea how poor they were. But they were really poor. And the like optimist, the utopian in my head, really sees a lot of connections between just like poverty is a major issue in the United States. Um, I'm having trouble putting myself back into myself at the time because I've learned a lot since then, not just about this country, but about the world and how it operates. And things are really complicated, and they're often way more complicated than even those of us who try to understand them get. But that said, like poverty in the United States is a really big problem. In other developing nations, I mean, we really stand alone. And I find it really a shame that even Martin Luther King expressed this, right, about how poverty was such an issue in the United States, and how Black people who are poor share a lot more with white people who are poor, but we try to convince white people who are poor that they're still on top of some sort of hierarchy, and so we don't want Black people to have nice things, for lack of better word,
Oh, I
right?
think that.
And
Yeah, I think that's a good way.
yeah,
That's a good way of putting it. It's kind of back to the defensive backlash that you were talking about before, right? A lot of people have a defensive backlash just because they don't even know what they don't know. Like, if they knew more, they might not actually be defensive. So, like, part of it comes from ignorance, pure ignorance. And, like, So ultimately, I think this criticism sometimes, like just to wrap it back around to the DEI programs we were talking about before, but like that criticism of DEI programs, sometimes I feel like it falls flat for me because I know as someone who has been having these conversations for 3 decades, people are always going to get defensive. Like, there is nothing you could do. There is no snake, slither, pretzel move that you can make that people won't get defensive and emotional and upset with these issues because these issues are upsetting. The issue of race and racism it's an upsetting issue. Like, there's not a lot of positives to it. But what a lot of people find is that even in delving into these difficult issues that they do have these reactions to, that they are emotional about, that they do get defensive about, if they actually do it, it's a positive experience. So it's this kind of paradox that exists, like that they can't imagine a positive experience coming out from that reaction. But like if you follow the road, that is what like 99% of people who at least I talk to about it, who I communicate with on the subject through the years, that's what they experience, you know?
Yeah, I mean, you're so right. People don't know what they don't know. And actually, in science, so people tend to be more confident about things that they know less about. And once you know more, you realize how complicated it is, and you start to adjust your confidence accordingly. And yeah, again, the optimist in me can't help but think that there might be a way to have these conversations that might not trigger that kind of backlash, which is why we try to have it that way. But I understand totally. I mean, as a female, trying to have conversations with men about the kinds of privileges that they have and how sexism can manifest itself results in the exact same thing. It's denial and defensive-ness, and yeah.
Oh yeah, I've seen it many times. I've seen it. I've seen many iterations. You know, I'm also a gay man, so I've seen it in that regard. You know, I've experienced the gambit of it. I feel like, you know, women feel more comfortable speaking to gay men more openly, more honestly. You know, a lot of women have revealed their rapist to me. Quite a large number, I would say, through the years. And you know, so we're talking on these kinds of levels throughout my life. I feel like it's given me a lot of insight into sexism. But even still, I know that as a man, that I'm never going to get to that level that they're at, like that a woman is at, you know, in terms of understanding it through their experience. But one thing that I notice is that a lot of people don't have the same perspective in terms of black people. So many racialized white people believe they have a complete and utter, they either believe they understand perfectly black people's experience or that they could never understand black people's experience, but they know what black people should be doing and thinking and saying and how they should be acting. You know, this is something
Can
that
you
I've
explain?
noticed.
I'm curious.
Go ahead.
Can you explain more? I'm really curious.
Yeah. So on social media, for example, but this also happens in real life all the time as well. Like, people will either say, like, I'll give you a specific example. I was on a walk in a state park nearby with, you know, a friend from high school, and we're talking about race. He is an immigrant from Russia. And, you know, we grew up together, we went to school together, and he was talking about how he felt ostracized, you know, as a Russian immigrant to the United States. And we were kind of connecting on that othering, you know, level. And he was like, oh, he was like, but I can never understand what it's like being black. And I've heard that so many times before, but when I hear it, people are typically using it like it's a shield. Like it's not like it's like a matter of fact, but like by saying this, I'm absolving myself of having to learn. And so I push back. I've been pushing back on that for a long time. I pushed back in this case, and I was like, well, like, I mean, I think you could try, you know, like, I think you could get pretty far. I said, I probably think you could probably get most of the way there, you know, like in terms of understanding. Of course, you're not going to ever experience what it's like, but like, I'm sure that you can understand quite a lot, you know, and no one, yet to receive a response from that response yet. It's just pretty much silence after that, because it forces people to think about whether they really want to know or not. And I've even gotten some people to admit after the fact that they don't want to know.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Well, because what I'm thinking is, like when I was talking about my experience as a woman, you said that, well, I guess now I'm not sure what you said, but to me, like it's the, as a man, you're never going to experience it. Is that how you said it? So, I guess I'm trying to think if I've said something like that regarding the Black experience and said, I mean, I want to hear the experiences, but as someone who's not Black, I'm never going to
Yeah,
experience
but that's the
that.
difference, is that you want to hear. A lot of people don't want to hear. They don't want to hear because they're scared of what they might hear. That's why.
Interesting.
Yeah, and so like, and I talk about this fear a lot. Somebody wrote a famous book about it. you know, but like there is a fear among a lot of racialized white people in terms of delving into this topic and actually like accepting the reality of it. That a tyrannical racial hierarchy was created. That it was weaved into our institutions and our systems of power and our social lives for generations, and by color of law. I think a lot of people, they don't want to think about what the implications of that reality is and what the consequences are. And our United States government has done a very good job of making sure that people don't have to think about it very much, and that they don't have to learn very much about it. And there's a lot of laws that have been passed to make sure that that remains in play going forward. So, what's your perspective on all of that?
Yeah. I guess the only thing I could think again, I'm maybe just in an optimistic mood. I'm not entirely sure. Um, but I feel like because a lot of that can provoke shame in people. And I don't know, have you ever read Brene Brown? I love Brene Brown, and I would put that at the top of anyone's reading list if you care about my recommendations. But so
I always take them. So, yeah.
she is wonderful. So she like one of the quotes that she says that always resonates with me is that people are hard to hate up close, so move in, right? And it's true. That's part of the reason why social media can be a place where we say things that we would not say in real life. um, but she also talks a lot about shame. Shame and guilt are two different things, right? um, Guilt is that I did something wrong, and shame is I am wrong, right? I did something bad versus I am bad. And I feel like I don't know if this is true, but it seems to me that a lot of people can interpret the kind of these sorts of historical things that have led to the imbalances of power that we talk about today, that is some sort of judgment on their character and that they should be ashamed about it. And I even hear some people on the left, they're well-meaning, but it ends up resulting in shame. And shame is an incredibly unproductive emotion. Guilt can be more productive. So I guess I kind of worry that some people don't like to hear about those parts of our history because it's shameful to them, as opposed to um, provoking some sort of like, so guilt means that I'm not bad. I did something bad, but I can do something different. So it's a more empowering emotion. And back to the DEI programs, that's what a lot of these DEI programs do. And it's not intentional, of course, but um, people can hear that white is bad. Being white means you need to be ashamed about this country's history or what your ancestors did, and that's not what that means, right? It should mean our history. There were white people in power and men in power who did certain things to maintain that power structure. Where we are today is not the result of your actions, but we are all in the same system. We can do something that changes everyone's lives for the better, right? So it's a different kind of framing.
I
And I
feel like that's
guess,
the same kind of framing that I hear from people who do DEI. I don't hear people trying to shame people. I don't think anyone who's really going out trying to shame people is getting hired to do DEI. Like, I think it's extremely rare. I think it's extremely rare. I've looked at tons of
I would
programs.
agree with you entirely that it is not the intention,
I,
but it is what I think that people hear.
right, but like I mean, we gotta we gotta drill down on that because, like, what's the origin of the shame? You know, like it's not the DEI program. You know, like I think we got to be very careful of like suggesting that DEI is making people feel shameful. That's not like really what's happening. Like what's really happening is that talking about issues of race and racism, it inspires in people, invokes in people a feeling of shame, like in
So
general.
let me give you an example. So the implicit biases. With the implicit biases, I wish I had the studies in front of me. I will provide them for you if you are interested in posting them with this episode. Implicit biases seem to suggest that at the better end, I have developed through my cultural training, through my priming, a bias against Black people. Let's just simplify it just to say that that's what we're talking about is bias against Black people. Which means that you are racist. And again, nobody wants to, well, I guess I shouldn't say, some people are probably pretty proud of being racist, but the vast majority of people don't like to own up to being racist. So being called racist because of the results of some sort of like test that's their unconscious is something that they may feel shame over. At the worst end, though, like if you're telling me that this is a bias that's under my level of consciousness that I'm not even aware of, well, I can't really change that, right? So teaching people that it's this sort of like bias that's out of their control, well, I can't act in a different way to make that any better. So why should I try and do anything?
Well, that's not how I see implicit bias. I feel like, or unconscious bias rather. The whole point is that if you become conscious of the bias, that you can do something about it. That's the whole point. It's that like the reason why you couldn't do anything about it is because you didn't know it existed. So like you once you do know it exists, then you do have the power to do something about it. It should be empowering. But then you have to admit that that was a situation that did occur. And that's what a lot of people don't want to do. A lot of people don't want
Yeah.
to admit that they were never in that scenario to begin with, and that's what scares them.
I'm not entirely sure that's true. Because it seems like with these tests, for example, they're measuring like split-second reactions to something. And if you're telling me that this is a bias that is, it's not in my higher order of thinking, it's not something that I'm aware of, what am I going to do about it? So this actually, these are the kinds of things that are coming out about why the implicit association test and the trainings aren't necessarily effective. And quite frankly, it doesn't matter what someone's unconscious is telling them. What matters is what their higher level thinking can do with that and how they behave. Those things are empowering.
People are always like fixated on measuring racism or categorizing racism, identifying racism, you know, that kind of thing. I feel like when you're racialized as black specifically, but like other races as well, depending upon what your experience has been, your geographical location, and all kinds of other things. But most racialized black people, I would say, fall in this category where we're not concerned with those things because we already, like, by experiencing the worst aspects of racism, those questions get answered for you through your experience. Like you don't have questions about measuring. You have to find out how to measure like for as a means of survival. So we have all kinds of techniques, like a litany of them, you know, figuring out like, you know, being conscious of racism for most of us isn't a thing because we have no choice because again, it's tied to our survival. So like, it's just like we approach the subject matter from a different arena because it's more directly tied to our, you know, livelihood, our lives and livelihood. Um, and so I just feel like thinking about measuring the impact of something to cure this problem is not something that really enters my mind. because the problem is so vast and extensive. Like, I feel like, of course, we want to attack it effectively, but ultimately, most people are not attacking it at all. Like, that's our current reality. And so, like, I think from that present, it doesn't really make sense to skip to, well, how can we measure success? Like, I understand that's what we typically do think of that at the beginning of a experiment or something like that in a science class or something like that. But I don't think it really applies to the subject of race in the same way. I mean, it does and it doesn't. Like, it does in that, like, it applies to any problem, but it doesn't in the fact that this problem is so vast and pervasive that, like, thinking about measuring success, I think for my show anyway, I measure success in the feedback that I get, right? People who are like, hey, like, I felt like I had this comment, but I couldn't say it, and here's why, and blah, blah, blah. Or, hey, like, you had the conversation with somebody that I watched, and, like, it was a conversation I wish I could have with my friends. Thank you for that. Now I know what I need to do. Or, like, I adopted a black kid, and I know there's a million things I don't know, and you've helped me so much. Or, like, these kinds of things. This is how I measure it in, like, feedback from people. But, like, quantitatively, I have no idea how you would measure such a thing,
Yeah, but you did just you gave various definitions of things that can be measured and things that can be improved. And I think if we're, especially if we're trying to solve a problem, it's important for us to understand what that problem is, and to understand it, it helps us to define and then measure, and then try to do things that adjust those variables and helps with the problem. So, I mean, yeah, this is a scientific approach to addressing the issue of racism, in this case, in various CEI programs.
That's why I hate the changing minds thing, because I'm like, you're not really, like, you can lead someone to the point, right up to the point, right? Like, right up to that line. And then they make the choice, right? That's how it really happens. I think it's so powerful to describe it that way instead of you change someone's minds, because it's too mystical and magical, it's too, and coercive, way of thinking about it, I feel like.
One of the ways that I start class is to say, okay, what have you been wrong about? What do you believe that you're wrong about? Right? What do you believe that's not true? And the students are all like, I mean, because if you didn't think it was true, you wouldn't believe it, right? But none of us hold all of our beliefs in line with reality.
Right. A lot of people know they believe things that aren't true, and they're comfortable with that, actually. I just know that for a fact, so I have to I have to put that in there.
Interesting. Well, okay. From my experience, people actually care about believing what's true, but only insofar as it aligns with what they want to believe.
Exactly. Like, so for me, that's why I'm such an alien, because I don't have that same limitation. Like, I am willing to, like, if you told me tomorrow that black people are genetically inferior, we figured it out, we found the genes XYZ, I would not be the one arguing against it. I wouldn't. Like, I wouldn't if it was true. Like, so like, that's the point. Like, it's like, I have never been running away from truth. I've had to face some tremendously difficult truths in my life, and, like, I've never run away from them. I've never once run away. And so, like, and it's not really hard for me. Like, and it never has been, really. Like, because I've always been so curious. And that's what I always bring up to people. It's my curiosity level. It's far beyond people that I encounter, like, I want to know. I want to know no matter how bad it is, no matter what it is. Like, I've always wanted that since I was a child. So I can't remember a time when I didn't.
You don't mind to be wrong, is what you're saying.
Of course not. I expect to be wrong because I'm a human. Like, so I know what a human is. Like, I knew it when I was a child. So I'm saying I knew it way back then. I was like, I know I'm going to be wrong. I realize that I'm going to be wrong all the time for the rest of my life. Like, I knew that. Like, and so I was like, okay, so under those circumstances, what do I do about that? I started doing that when I was 8. Like, it's been 3 decades since then. So I've come up with a lot of different ways to deal with it. And so, like, I'm right in your wheelhouse. Like, I appreciate everything you're saying. Like, and I think that anyone who's in that situation where they're just realizing, like, hey, like, I may not be able to rely on my own thoughts like all the time. That's great if you're having that thought. It means that you're growing as a human. Is you're understanding yourself more. And so yeah, I'm glad that
Daniel,
people.
who was the who won the a Nobel Prize in economics for in part for his work on cognitive biases, has this great quote, and I'm going to mess it up because it's also coming through Adam Grant, who I highly recommend reading if you've not read Adam Grant. Um, something like he wants to he's glad when he's found to be wrong, because it means that he's less wrong. Right. So he says something about if you can embrace the joy of being wrong, it means that you're less wrong than you were before. Most people, though, they hold beliefs so tightly, the beliefs become part of their identity. And to be fair, that's how we come to some of our beliefs, is because the people that we identify with hold those beliefs. Right. So our group that we feel that we belong to, our social group, believes certain things. So we just accept it as truth. We trust them. Belief in those certain things becomes part of like the litmus test that you have to pass to be part of that group. And questioning those beliefs actually means that you risk your membership in that tribe. So it literally becomes tribe over truth. Our membership, what is her name? There's a great social psychologist. Oh my god, I'm going to forget her name, but she says something like, if there is an E equals MC squared of social psychology, it's that social death is worse than physical death. So like over the last few years, we've seen people who will die from COVID, completely denying the existence of COVID. And to a lot of people, that looks really crazy. That looks like, how in the world could you possibly believe that? But physical death was less important than social death. They don't want to risk membership in that tribe. So for a lot of people, understanding that those beliefs, when they become so tied to our identity, the part of our brain that is activated by physical threats becomes activated when that belief is threatened. So we take it as a personal threat, and there's that defensiveness, right? And we're not going to get through that because they're defending themselves. So
I
the
mean,
question is,
not actually, but like in their imagination, basically.
in their mind, that
Right.
is what's real. Yes. And so I asked my students, okay, how many species of elephant are there? Right? Do you know how many species of elephant there are?
Nope.
Do you care if you're wrong?
Nope.
Nope. And students will say, no, I don't care if I'm wrong. I'm like, well, there's three, right? And I'll talk about the three. Okay, if you were wrong, do you care that you're wrong? No, why would I care? Great, I learned something new. Awesome. Can you imagine feeling that level of care and changing your mind for all of your other beliefs? Like, for example, climate change, evolution, GMOs, right? So how much easier it would be to change our minds and align our beliefs with evidence when we took it less personally. And that lesson is so important for thinking better. But it not only means that we need to be okay with being wrong, it means that we need to be okay with letting others be wrong. Right. And often what we do is we mock, we attack, right? Oh, they're flip floppers. They've changed their mind. What is wrong with changing your mind with evidence? I do not understand why that's a bad thing, right? So letting others grow, letting others change their mind, allowing them, not attacking them for it, right? Setting that tone. Yeah. I've been teaching about climate change for a long time, since like the late 90s. And in the late 90s, look, it was well known, the human impact on climate. It was pretty well known in the 60s. By the 80s, it was decently established. By the early aughts, it was like, there's really no other reasonable explanation. But in that period of time, the message for what we can do about it has gone from eat less meat and change out your light bulbs to individual action is not necessarily what we need here, right? What we need here is systemic action. You can go vegan and you can have no kids and never fly in an airplane, and it's not going to make that big of a difference. So the goal has changed from like changing individual behavior to a systemic one. And that seems to me like what needs to happen here is a more systemic level of change. I'm just curious what you think of that.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think that's why systemic racism is something that's more prevalent in the national dialogue now and the international dialogue as well. Like, I think that that's the stage that we're at, is one where people are now more willing to recognize systemic racism. Well, it's a little bit difficult to deny it at this point. There's kind of a lot of evidence of it. So I think that that's helped. But yeah, no, I mean, we've always needed a systemic solution for racism because it's been a systemic problem for generations, right? Like, I mean, I think racism is unlike most other problems, you know, like it really confounds a lot of the stuff we're talking about today. And I'd like to, maybe we'll have you back on to talk about some of those confounding issues because actually, you know what? We have a little bit of time and I have your notes right here. Hang
Okay.
on.
My brain dump.
Yeah, your brain dump. Hang on. So, one thing you wrote here was I'm just gonna kind of read some of your brain dumps and read some of the notes that I wrote. I only wrote like very brief things about them. So, solving problems requires understanding them. That's something you've said during our conversation today, and something that I always teach my classes when I do problem solving. First step of problem solving is identification, right? Identify the problem. If you can't identify it, you can't solve it. It ain't happening. All right. So, and then what I wrote was, you know, that's the issue in the race context because education about race hasn't happened. We don't teach people about race or racism. We teach about slavery a little bit, and we teach about the civil rights movement a little bit, and that's basically all people learn about race. And so like
I'm shocked because the civil rights movement is when we won racism.
right, exactly, right, and the battle was won. But like yeah, now I mean that was never a realistic viewpoint of the subject matter, you know, and it's not a critical way of thinking about the subject matter. We still are on step one in the race context of identification. Some people have devoted their lives studying the subject matter. You know, we have their knowledge, we have their stories, but like that knowledge is not valued because a lot of those people are black. If you notice, a lot of the most famous people who talk about race these days are white, and that has been true like through the generations as well. Now, yeah, people have different understandings of what racism is and its origins. Confusing people about the origin and knowledge of racism is a part of racism, even. So that is it creates this very complex dilemma there. You have any comments on that part?
Yeah, I mean, when we talk about like, so here's the difficulty in having a conversation like this. So let's say that we want to talk about racism. Step one, what do we mean by that? Right? Because your definition could be different than mine. And so we're talking over each other, and we didn't start by clearly identifying our terms. So there's that famous Albert Einstein quote: if I was given like an hour to solve a problem, I'd spend the first 59 minutes figuring out the problem. I'm paraphrasing here, but like it's so important to first identify what it is that we're talking about. And when we're talking to somebody else, making sure that we're talking about the same thing, because often our disagreements come down to what we mean by that word, right? Yeah, the same thing is true with something like sexism. Like, what do we mean by that, right? I could start telling you about all the ways that I've experienced sexism, but if you didn't think that, if you thought sexism was like women not getting as equal pay as men, then we're never going to agree, right? And but if we're going to solve a problem, like there are certain solutions that may feel good. Like we know we need to do something. And actually that's what those DEI programs often are, is we know we need to do something, and this is something, so let's do this. But we don't know what it is that we're going for. And if we're going to solve the problem, we need to identify what it is and what we mean. Oftentimes, these problems are multi-causal with lots of different variables. And so identifying as many of those as we can, and then figuring out what we mean by solving something. And all of that to me, that's where the majority of the work comes in. Like, because if we can't agree on those things, then we're just going to keep spinning our wheels and talking past each other.
Totally agree. Yeah. And that's where we're at in the race context. We're spinning our wheels basically. But like we are having the conversation, we're starting to talk about what we all think racism is, you know. Obviously, we're all racialized differently, and how we're racialized is going to impact what we think racism is. Like, for instance, people racialized as black, like myself, are probably going to have more of a curiosity and interest in learning about the subject of race and studying it. And so, and people who are racialized as white have probably a less likely chance of doing that kind of investigation. Like you mentioned, you grew up around mostly, almost exclusively white people. And so, like, if you're not around that, if you're not really in a environment where anyone is racialized differently, you probably won't even think about race. So, like, because we have people on these, this huge spectrum, and that spectrum is divided to a certain extent along racial lines, it complicates the issue of identification, because ultimately it's going to require some kind of trust between the groups that have different perceptive experiences. And that trust has been diluted by racism itself. So like it's very like incestuous in the way that it operates. Racism has a way of cutting off any avenues of success of like undoing it. And that's what makes it a little bit different from other problems, I think.